Hey everybody, it is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode of Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul. And today we are going back to the early 1990s once again for an outstanding vocal performance by one of my all-time favorite singers. Let me show you who I'm talking about and put it into some context, and then I'll give you the backstory here really quick before we get to the song. Here is our album from 1992. There he is. It's Peter Cetera and the album World Falling Down, his best solo album, in my humble opinion. And we're going to be hearing a song called Have You Ever Been in Love? Now, my backstory with Peter Cetera, of course, is a long and complicated one. Peter and I go all the way back there to the beginning and those early Chicago days. And as I have said in a couple other videos, I think that original run of Chicago albums with Terry Kath and Peter Cetera and the original lineup there from 1969 to 1977, before Terry Kath passed, those first 11 albums, that is my favorite band, my favorite group sound that I've ever had from any group. I love that group sound and that catalog right there more than anything. And when it comes to Peter Cetera, I especially love Peter Cetera within that context. I love Peter Cetera as a bass player in that rhythm section with Terry Kath on guitar and Danny Seraphine on drums and Robert Lamb on keyboards, that great Chicago rhythm section there from the late 60s and 70s. I love Peter Cetera as a bass player in that lineup. Also love Peter Cetera as a singer in that concept with Robert Lamb and Terry Kath both being vocalists as well. I love that vocal dynamic with the three singers. And I always thought it worked out great for everybody later on there in Chicago when Peter Cetera was writing songs, and you had the balancing dynamic of a fourth songwriter, Peter, to go along with Terry Kath and Robert Lamb and James Pankow, who were the principal songwriters there in that original run for Chicago. So to be very clear, for Peter Cetera's career, that is my favorite part of his career. That's my favorite context for his voice and for his bass playing and for his talents in general. And of course, tragically, once Terry Kath died there in 1978, the entire balance and the dynamic shifted completely. And over the next few years there, Peter Cetera eventually became the front man of Chicago for all intents and purposes. And that resulted in a couple big hit albums there in 1982 and 1984, Chicago 16 and 17. And working with David Foster there as the producer of Chicago, Peter Cetera was really the show at that point. So Peter Cetera, as we know, left Chicago in 1985 and went solo. He did have a solo album out that not a lot of people know about while he was still a member of Chicago. In 1981, his first solo album, that was the one with Living in the Limelight on it. Then eventually when Peter Cetera left Chicago in 1985, of course, his next record in 1986, which most people thought was his first solo album, was actually his second. And that album, Solitude Solitaire, was the album that had a couple of huge hits, The Glory of Love and The Next Time I Fall, that duet with Amy Grant. Both of those songs made it all the way up to #1 for Peter Cetera. In 1988, he released his third solo album. That was a record called One More Story. That album also had a big hit on it. That was the album with One Good Woman. And 4 years later, in 1992, Peter released his fourth solo album, this one, World Falling Down, which our song of the day today, Have You Ever Been in Love? Now, as I said, for my money, this is far and away Peter Cetera's best solo album. A lot of good songs on here, good to very good to even a couple great tunes on this album. So although I would say on the whole, I much prefer, as I said, the Chicago era version of Peter Cetera. When it comes to his solo career, this is definitely the record to have. Three big hits off this album for Peter Cetera. Restless Heart made it all the way up to the #1 spot on the Adult Contemporary chart. Even a Fool Can See made it all the way up to #2 on the Adult Contemporary chart. And then Peter's great duet with Chaka Khan, Feels Like Heaven, topped out at #5 on the Adult Contemporary chart. So a lot of airplay and a lot of radio hits on this record for Peter Cetera, but not a lot of album success per se. But none of that matters to me. I was always a huge Peter Cetera fan as a bass player, as I said, there with Chicago, and as a singer, one of the all-time great singers. What can I say about Peter Cetera? I mean, for the bulk of my life, I would say if you had asked me to just name one guy, just name one favorite singer that I have, it would have been a quick and easy answer, and that answer would have been Peter Cetera. So all these years later, of course, in hindsight, and there's so much more music now that I've been exposed to and that I love. And at this point of my life, I don't get involved in who's better or who's the greatest or any of that. But certainly Peter Cetera is still among my favorites, among my all-time favorites. And never a doubt about that. What a great singer. Peter retired here quietly a couple years ago, and passing into his retirement years now, going out quietly, as is his style. But boy, he was never quiet with that great voice back there in the day on all those incredible Chicago albums. And again, sprinkled throughout his solo career, there are plenty of nuggets that show off the incredible vocal ability of Peter Cetera. I could have picked so many songs. Even out of his solo career, there's a handful of stuff I really want to play for you guys. And this one, the album closer, Have You Ever Been in Love? And I suspect that Peter himself must have loved this song as well, because if I'm not mistaken, for many years there, about a decade or so ago, when he was doing his symphony tours and performing with large symphonies, if I'm not mistaken, this was the show closer for Peter's solo concerts there, and performed a very interesting rendition, almost like an a cappella version with just his voice and a little bit of instrumentation, and oftentimes even featuring the cello as a lead instrument, which I thought was fascinating. But so I've heard some good live versions of this. Peter seems to love this song just like I do, and I hope you love it as well. What an interesting number. It's pretty dynamic. It starts out very quiet, and then it gets loud, kind of like some of those old Chicago records, right? Pretty dynamic, start slow and then build up. A similar, I guess, somewhat treatment on this one for Peter. Not a song that he wrote. This was written by his producer, Andy Hill, and a couple other gentlemen. So not a Peter Cetera composition, but one whale of a vocal performance, as you will hear. Remember a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Barry Gibb, when I did that Reaching Out video, and then I followed it up with the Barry Gibb solo tune? And I said, boy, that table that Barry Gibb sits at in my mind and in my heart, in my soul, there aren't a lot of other singers at that table. That's how high I hold Barry Gibb. And Peter Cetera is at that table, folks. There's two pretty good singers for you. How about Barry Gibb and Peter Cetera? Two giants, two incredible vocalists, if you ask me, and absolutely two of my all-time favorites. Let's hear Peter right now from 1992, Have You Ever Been in Love? What a great lyric on this song too, folks. Check out these lyrics.
the seeds of the soul. Have you ever been in love? Have there been times to laugh and times to really want to cry, finding reasons to believe it, 'cause you're dying to see the light. When in times of doubt, have you ever tried to walk it out? Still she leaves you wondering what it's all about. And when she's far away, have you ever felt the need to stray, trying to discover just doesn't pay? 'Cause with her it can be true, and with her it can be you. Have you ever been in love?
I'm going to pause it here just for a second before the big build-up, and then I'll rewind it so you folks can check it out. But I think it's pretty well accepted in pop music circles that Peter Cetera, certainly one of the all-time great tenor singers in the pop rock biz, and you can still see why even at this point in his solo career, Peter was still letting it rip. So when he hits those high notes and slides around and does that Peter Cetera stuff that he does, wow, it always knocked me out. As I said, going all the way back to those old Chicago records, it was always just a knockout, that voice. That voice could just sing anything as far as I was concerned. I'm going to rewind just a little bit here so we get the big build up.
And with her it can be you. Have you ever been in love? What it's all about. And when the night comes down, can you call your house a home? Do you dream you're still together? You wake up alone. Have you ever been in love the way that I'm in love? Have you ever been in love?
Yeah, easy to see. Don't have to figure that one out. What a voice, what a sound. Never been another tenor singer that sounds even remotely like Peter Cetera, even though they tried to get every other Chicago singer after him to sound like him. They never did, and neither could anybody else. Such a unique voice, and boy, once they figured out there back in the 70s that sound with Peter Cetera on the lead vocal and then overdubbing his harmonies with himself on the backgrounds, that was a combo that made about $1 gazillion for him and those guys, huh? What a sound. Great. Peter Cetera, have you ever been in love? Here's another picture of Peter. I have quite a backstory with Peter. So I got to interview him back there in the summer of 1986. I put in a request to interview him. It was granted, and at that time, I was about as big of a Peter Cetera fan I could possibly be. This is coming off of that Chicago 17 album and tour. Just a phenomenal wave of success there for Chicago and Peter Cetera in the mid-'80s. I put in the request to interview him there after he had gone solo, the year after he went solo. And in fact, the week that I interviewed him, Glory of Love was still sitting at #1 on the charts. Had a rather amazing conversation with Peter Cetera back there in the day. I think they were giving most of the journalists that day 15 or 20 minutes with him maximum. Back there, he was doing publicity for the new album back there from New York at the record company offices. And I called him up from Seattle. I think they were giving most of the people 15 or 20 minutes. And I got almost an hour with Peter. And we talked all about his then new record, Solitude Solitaire, and all of the songs on that album, and his solo career in general, and his music, and his philosophy of life, and the old Chicago stuff, the whole thing. And I have to tell you, I told Peter, of course, right at the beginning of the interview, I said, this is just the biggest thrill in the world for me, because I have been a fan of yours and followed your career from the beginning. And to finally get to speak to him all those years later was just such a kick for me. And as soon as I told him that, like I said, that's probably about the time that the interview went from being a 15 or 20-minute job to almost an hour, because Peter just relaxed and started talking, and we were laughing and having a great old time. And it always kind of made me laugh when I would hear people talking about, oh, he was so cool, and cool like as in cold, aloof and all this stuff, and not warm and not very engaging. And I thought, really? I had the exact opposite feeling about the brother. Peter Cetera could not possibly have been more accommodating to me. And the even more crazy part is that after that interview, we actually ended up corresponding and keeping in touch for a while. And that all started when he sent me a postcard completely unsolicited, just thanking me and wishing me good luck and regards and all of that stuff. And that actually went on for a few years. So whatever you want to say about Peter Cetera, go ahead and say it. But I got firsthand information that if you approached this guy the right way, he could not possibly have been warmer and more accommodating and funny and insightful, and just a great interview and a great guy to keep up with there for a few years after that interview. Nothing but good stuff to say about Peter Cetera, one of my all-time favorite bass players. I've told you guys how much I love bass, of course. Peter Cetera was my man. I mean, that's why I went and bought a bass in the first place. I wanted to be Peter Cetera. After I saw Chicago that first time in concert in 1975 and saw him rocking that bass and hitting those vocals, I said, damn, that's what I want to do in life. And so I went and got me a bass. I did not become the next Peter Cetera, tragically, as you can see. Don't rub it in. But yeah, that was my inspiration back there, man. Peter was such a huge inspiration, and that old Chicago stuff had me all fired up and wanting to be a musician. Never even bothered trying to sing. Forget that part. If I couldn't play the bass, I certainly wasn't going to even try to sing like he was singing. But just a huge inspiration for me always. And as I said again, once I got to talk to him, first on that interview there in 1986, and then all these years later, this is 2004, when we finally met, when he was doing a meet and greet out here in Seattle for his Christmas album, I think was his record that he was promoting back then, 2004. What a great guy, super nice to me and my family and my friends that were there as well. Couldn't have been nicer. So happy that he's enjoying his retirement and had his priorities in order there once he left Chicago and got off the road. He was able to work when he wanted to work and not have to kill himself on the road like they continue to do all these years later. But yeah, wow. Peter Cetera, what a figure and what an influence for me. Enjoy your retirement, Mr. Cetera. A job exceedingly well done, and a song exceedingly well done as well. How about this song? Have you ever been in love? Sounds like they're doing kind of a Terry Kath from the Great Beyond on that guitar solo almost, or maybe a little bit of David Gilmour mixed in there. You never really know for sure. Peter Cetera obviously in the band with Terry Kath all those years, and Peter Cetera also a big fan of David Gilmour, who has guested on one of Peter's albums back there in the late 80s. That was the One More Story album, and David Gilmour appeared on guitar on a couple songs on that record. And you can hear that influence on this song. That guitar break there sure sounds like it's got some David Gilmour, Terry Kath mixed in there somewhere, doesn't it? Peter Cetera, thank you, my brother. Great career. Love so much of this guy's music. And again, his bass playing, man, that's what made me want to be a musician in the first place. Hope you guys liked Have You Ever Been in Love? Tomorrow on the big program, we are going to slide into one of my all-time favorite musical concepts that I used to love to program. And I'm going to try to jump back into it and see if I can pick up where I left off way back there in the day at AEI. I don't want to tell you too much about it. It involves the 80s. So let's see what happens tomorrow. I'm not even going to say it. I almost said it. See you tomorrow, guys. Peter Cetera. Hell yeah. Bassist, vocalist extraordinaire. That's what they used to say back in the 70s, and they were right.